Hi, everyone. I'm Mercedes from Rocky Nook. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this webinar with Abarian X Pirello. We're really excited to have him. And I just want to mention that we're doing this because his new book just came out, Making Photographs, which is now available and shipping from our warehouse. So if you buy it on our website, it'll ship out to you today or tomorrow, actually. And because you're here, you'll get a special coupon code for 40% off your purchase. I'll post the information on that in the chat, and it should also be in the email that you got with your RSVP. But I'll make sure that you guys have that information again so you can use that coupon code if you're interested. So Abarian X Pirello is a photographer, writer, educator, and host of the Candid Frame Photography podcast. He has over 25 years of experience in the photographic industry. In his role as host and producer of The Candid Frame, he provides frank, insightful interviews with some of the industry's top established and emerging photographers. The popular show enjoys a following among photo enthusiasts from all over the world. The weekly program is consistently ranked among the top programs of its type. Abarian X is also the author of 6 books, including his latest book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. He currently lives in the Los Angeles area with his wife and their dog, Zoe. He's with us today because, as I mentioned, we just released Making Photographs. It is available and shipping now. I'll give you the information on the 40% off discount code shortly in the chat, and we'll make sure you guys have that information. So without any more hesitation, I'll turn this over to Abarian X. Hi, Abarian X. Thanks for joining us today.
Mercedes, good to be with you.
I will let you take it over from here.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. From the chat, I can see I got people from South Africa and New Zealand and France and Canada. So I'm really excited to be able to share with you some insights from the book and just my own experience with photography. So I want to jump into talking about light and shadow, but I wanted to give you an idea as to, why I wanted to create the book in the first place. My first book was Chasing the Light. And it was really, at the time, was my own personal way of reinventing myself as a photographer, because I had gotten to a point where I felt like my work had gotten stagnant, that I was repeating myself. And it wasn't until I really started looking at other people's work and recognizing how they use light that it really sort of transformed everything that I did. And though I've written some books since then, I haven't written a book that I would really consider a follow-up to that until I wrote this book. And the book came about because when I taught my workshops, one of the things I would often find is we would go out, I would give them some basic instruction in terms of, what I call the visual draws, which are light and shadow, line and shape, color, gesture. And I would just walk them through my simple approach for going out and making photographs. And time after time, we would come back and they would all say, yeah, we were out there for a while, but I don't think I got anything good. And when we would sit down and I would look at the photographs and we started critiquing them and evaluating them, without exception, everyone came away with some really great photographs. And I started recognizing that the issue was, for these photographers and for a lot of photographers, is that they sometimes would be able to make a really good image, but they really didn't understand how they did it. They really couldn't repeat the process. And they oftentimes would consider it more luck than skill or talent that allowed them to create the photographs. And I completely related to that, because I remember going out there, with all my camera equipment, with all these lenses, and going out and making photographs and feeling incredibly frustrated that I couldn't make good images consistently. I had an understanding of the mechanics of my camera, but there was something missing between me handling the camera and connecting it to what I was seeing in front of me. So the idea behind the book was to, on paper, encapsulate what I teach in my workshops, which I think has helped a lot of photographers sort of bridge that gap between the mechanics of the camera and how they see. Because the book, more than anything else, is really about not only developing a personal way of seeing, but using that seeing. So when you're going out there to photograph, you understand what you're doing. You are aware of your own process, how you react to a scene, how you react to light and line. And you use that information to make more informed choices when you're creating a composition in a photograph. And then you use that same knowledge to edit your pictures, not by which I mean what you do in Photoshop, but being able to look at your photographs and being able to say, okay, this one works better than that one. Oh, this is a good shot, and understand why it's a good shot. And also understand why some shots don't work. Because the shots that don't work are just as valuable as the ones that do, probably more so. Because the ones that don't work, if you understand why they don't work, they go into that library inside of your head that informs you and your choices the next time that you go out. So you may have failed in making a good photograph that day, but if you've learned from those images, you'll understand that, oh, it was because I didn't pay attention to what was happening on the edges of my frame. Or, I should have used a shallower or deeper depth of field, or I needed to get physically lower on the ground in order to create the composition, rather than being frustrated and feeling like, oh, I'm just not talented, I'm just not good. Realizing that you do have the potential to be able to make good photographs. It's just that you have to understand how you see and how you respond to a scene. So for today, I wanted to focus primarily on light and shadow. And that's just one of the smaller components of what I address in the book. But I thought it would be a really great place to start to discuss the ideas of how you develop a personal visual workflow. So I'm going to share my screen and let me know when you see the screen here. Mercedes, can you tell me whether or not you see it? Because I'm not seeing the chat at this point.
We don't see your screen just yet.
Okay. Oh yeah, there's a slight delay of about 45 seconds. So let me know as soon as it's up there.
Try reconnecting your screen again. It doesn't seem to be coming up.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go with the entire screen and how's that?
There we go. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. So light and shadow. So I want to start off with just talking about this, why it's important to me. Now, when I go out to photograph, one of the things that I try to do is go out with a blank slate. I don't go out with the intention of photographing anything specifically, even though I do a lot of street photography and travel photography and, and street portraiture. I'm not going out with the intent of saying, I'm going to make this kind of photograph, because I think that's way too limiting. And I think the idea of going out and thinking I'm only going to photograph a certain thing limits your ability to be able to recognize a scene and to see the potential of it. And what I call it is seeing literally. That idea that you're looking at a chair as a chair, or you're looking at a desk as a desk, or as a fire hydrant as just a fire hydrant. What happens a lot in our lives is that we look at objects, we look at things, and we see them as nothing more as what function they play in our lives. So this quote from Dorothea Lange, I think, really quantifies what I hope to express to you guys today, is that the camera is an instrument that teaches people how to see without a camera. Because if we can develop that special and unique way of seeing, then everything has the potential of becoming a great photograph. You probably had this experience, because God knows I did early on, when I would go out with my cameras and I would spend 2 or 3 or more hours out photographing. And then I'd come home with nothing. And my wife or someone else would ask me, how did it go? And I would tell them, I didn't get anything. There wasn't anything interesting to photograph. And the truth was, there probably was an abundance of things to photograph. It's just that I wasn't seeing. I wasn't seeing them and responding to them in a way that allowed me to recognize the potential of any given moment, subject, scene, from being a really great photograph. And so the catalyst for me is when I started looking at light, and in this case, light and shadow, where I didn't look at the object of my attention, but rather how light and shadow played off of the subject. And when I started doing that, I started seeing graphically. I started seeing color, light, pattern, shape, gesture. And I was being drawn to scenes and subject matter that I would never have considered otherwise. Because if I was walking around the street and I was just looking for an interesting character, I was shutting off a bunch of other things that were around me that had the potential of being a really great photograph just because I was just being too myopic, too concerned in having something grab me and leaping out at me. So by paying attention to light and shadow, that was always my first step. So I would go out and I would just evaluate what's happening with light and shadow. And when I was just paying attention to that, things would pop out at me. And it wouldn't necessarily in that moment be a great photograph, but it would draw me to a scene. I would see a play of light and shadow, like in this case at the entrance to a subway here in downtown Los Angeles. And I'm walking up the steps, ready to catch the train back home after a day of shooting. And this is a moment when I could have just been on my phone or, reading a newspaper or texting. But as I was coming up, I noticed the shadows up on the wall, and I immediately stopped part way on the stairwell, positioned myself against the wall, and figured out my frame, and then just waited as people walked up and down the steps until I finally had one frame where the result was this photograph. But if I had been distracted with something else, if I wasn't constantly observing light and shadow, I would have completely missed this, because there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people going up down these stairs throughout the day. But I was probably the only one that day who paid attention to what was happening with light and shadow in this particular moment. So when I think about light and observing light, there are three considerations that I think are absolutely important to begin to understand and to grasp, so that you can leverage whatever quality of light that you have for your photographs. And they are quantity, quality, and direction. So quantity, quality, and direction. If you ask yourself these three questions, they inform a lot of what you can do for your photography. And each of these things is going to be tied to what happens with your camera. Because one of the things that can happen, especially if you're not completely comfortable with the camera, with its settings, even though you may understand what ISO does and white balance does and aperture does, sometimes there's a disconnect between what the camera does and the settings and what you're trying to achieve. And there can be this level of confusion and frustration and anxiety. And, you guys know that feeling where you see something and you're putzing around with the camera, trying to figure out what to do. And then the moment passes you by. Well, by starting in this way, by observing the light and asking yourself these three questions, you get to make a lot of choices even before that moment reveals itself and that you can make a photograph. Now, the quality of the light is directly related for me with ISO. How much light informs the sensitivity that I need to set my camera for in order to ensure not only that I get enough light, but that I have a fast enough shutter speed in order to ensure a sharp photograph. Because there are plenty of shots that I thought had great potential, but because the ISO was too low and my shutter speed was too low, I introduced camera shake or subject motion, and the shot was ruined. And so by observing how much light I have to work with, well, that tells me a whole lot, and that also informs what's going to be my settings. Now, oftentimes when I leave for the day, I always have my camera with me. And as soon as I walk out of the house, I just observe what the light's like. And if it's a bright sunny day, I set my ISO to 400. And I set my aperture to 5.6. And One of the reasons I do that is because I always recognize what my default is, especially when it comes to my aperture. So if it's a bright, sunny day and I set my aperture to 5.6, and if at any point I want to change my aperture and get a smaller aperture, like f8, f11, f16, I know I can go all the way down to f16 and get a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Now, for me, the base shutter speed that I try to shoot at is about a 200th of a second. I don't like shooting any slower than that just because I'm not able to hold a camera as steady as I could 30 years ago. And if I shoot below 20th of a second, I'm really pushing it in terms of being able to hold the camera steady enough that I can get a sharp photograph. So by setting my ISO to 400, and since most cameras today give you excellent results at 400, I know that even without looking at my camera, I could switch my aperture to something as small as f16 and still have fast enough of a shutter speed in order to get a sharp photograph. I don't even have to think about it. Now, if I go out and the light is have less light to work with, if it's a cloudy day or overcast, and I have my ISO set for 400, then my aperture, you can see here, is 5.6 of 500th of a second. And if I go up, and actually, I think this slide is wrong. I'll have to, yeah, this slide is wrong. This actually should be for 800. ISO 800 at 500 to 5.6. I should be able to choose an aperture of f4, 2.8, 8, and still have the ability within that aperture range of having a really fast enough shutter speed. So if it's cloudy, I'll increase my ISO to 800, or if it's overcast, or if I go into an area of deep shade, I'll increase my ISO just to make sure that my shutter speed is fast enough. There are going to be times where I may choose a slower ISO, but it's also always going to be relative to what's happening with my shutter speed. So when I'm having lunch with a friend of mine in a ramen restaurant, I see this guy come in with this beard and this hat, and I know, God, I got to photograph this guy. But even before I approach him, I'm already thinking about where's the light coming from, and got this great window light coming in from the restaurant on my right-hand side. And it's a bright day, so I know I'm getting a good quantity of light coming into the scene. And I'm even able to meter from where I'm sitting into the scene to get a sense that at ISO 100, at 2.8, at 1/25th of a second, I'm good to be able to get a really shallow depth of field, because I was already thinking about, I want to isolate his face. And the only place I could really photograph him well was at this table in front of the chalkboard where the menu was being written. So I knew I wanted to get that really shallow depth of field. And when I asked him and if I could make his photograph, I asked him to sit down, and I made a couple of frames of him. But once I just briefly checked my shutter speed and I saw that I was working at 2.8 and that ISO 100 was more than enough, I went ahead and made my shot. If I saw that ISO 100 was giving me a even slower shutter speed than 1/25th of a second, I probably would have boosted my ISO to 400. But I felt like I only had so much time, and I really literally only had about 5 frames before he answered the phone to speak to his wife. So this was the only shot that I was really, really pleased with. And you really only need one. When the light starts getting lower, that's when you are at risk of getting shots that are blurred and getting soft. So it becomes really incumbent on you to pay attention to how much light you have to work with, and not hesitating to increase the ISO as high as you need to in order to make sure you have a reasonable shutter speed. Here, I shot at f4 at 1,000, and I think with both of these 2 shots, I was using a Leica Q with a 28 millimeter lens. So I'm using a really slow shutter speed at 60th of a second, more so because when I'm indoors, I'll tend to risk using slower shutter speeds because I don't want to go too high in terms of ISO. When I'm out on the street, that's where I tend to use my 400 or 800 ISO on average. But here I felt that a 60th of a second with a 28 millimeter lens and a full frame camera, I was more than capable of being able to hold it steady. And as you can see here, the image is really sharp. But I'm conscious of that. I'm not oblivious to the fact that my shutter speed is low and that I have to increase the ISO in order to be able to do that. So the next thing is quality, and the quality of the light, and I equate that with color. Because if you're dealing with a hard quality of light, then colors tend to pop, right? Because you get that light hitting a wall or fabric of clothing, and the reds, the yellows, the blues, they just explode with saturation. Those same things in more muted light, in on an overcast day or in shade, those colors become a little duller. And that's something that you have to be aware of as you are evaluating any scene. Is like, how is the light that is present affecting the color? And though a lot of cameras today have an auto white balance setting, and I do shoot raw, and I know a lot of people shoot raw, I always try to start with the preset for the sunny, the overcast, the fluorescent white balance. One, because it tends to be a little more accurate than the auto white balance, but it also makes all the images out of that series consistent. Because if you're using the auto white balance of any camera, and as you start moving around the scene, as elements in the scene change, so may the white balance, the auto white balance on the camera, making it a little difficult to sort of batch process a series of images to be equally affected by a change in the software. So when I photograph this guy's hands, we're in open shade. So my white balance is set to shade. I've already made my adjustments in terms of shutter speed and aperture. And so now all I'm focused on is using a shallow enough depth of field that I get his fingers and the tattoos on his fingers sharp, while the rest is out of focus. So I'm not thinking about, oh, what should my shutter speed and my aperture be? Because I've already figured that out even before I've encountered this fellow. I mean, I see him, I see what kind of light I have to work with. So I've adjusted my ISO, my base aperture is 5.6, my white balance is set for, shade or cloudy. And so when I find the subject, the only setting change that I have to do change on my camera is just my aperture. So all I need to do is just ask him to move into the scene, hold his hands up, change my aperture, and get the focus right to get the shot. So the less I'm paying attention to the camera, the more it allows me to pay attention to the moment. So when I'm dealing with direct sunlight, as you can see here, the colors in the morning of the direct sunlight really make these oranges and these yellows and these, reds just pop. And again, my settings have been set so that I don't have to worry about shutter speed or aperture or white balance. All I have to do is wait for the right subject to come in to help complete the scene. At this point, I'm just focused primarily on composition. I'm not concerned with, oh, what's my camera doing? Because a moment like this is so fleeting that if my head is buried in the camera, I'll miss the shot. I may take an initial shot just to make sure that everything is set correctly. But once that initial shot is done, I'm not going back and forth between shooting and chimping, shooting and chimping. Because in that moment, when I turn my head down to my camera, trying to figure out whether everything is correct, the ideal moment can pass me by. And it's happened to me countless numbers of times. But when you gain this sort of confidence in terms of what you're doing with your camera, there's an amazing amount of freedom that you enjoy in terms of being able to dedicate your time to seeing rather than being focused on the camera. Because the more focused you are on your camera, the less you are to moments like this. This father and daughter are sharing this really nice moment. She's in tears as she's hugging her father. And I see this moment, but I was already aware of where the light was coming from, these large sliding glass doors on the right. So when I positioned myself, my settings had already been set for this space that I was in. So all I was doing was jockeying for position and trying to position myself so that I not only got a good shot that included their expressions, but also of her father's new bride getting the makeup done in the background, because it wasn't just about creating an aesthetically pleasing picture at this point. It was also about trying to tell a story. Now, next is just the direction of the light. If you pay attention to what the quality of the light is, you are already somewhat aware of where the light is coming from. And I'm going to be speaking largely about, available light, but even if you're indoors and you're dealing with fluorescent, tungsten, LED lights, this still plays a role. Because one of the things that you need to understand is where is the light coming from? Because it tells you about the quality of the light in terms of, in terms of color. It tells you about the quantity of the light to have an understanding in terms of, okay, is the light behind me? Is it coming from inside a doorway? But when you're aware of the direction of the light, things open up to you with respect to contrast. Because great images, whether they're color or they're black and white, often revolve about contrast, not just between light and dark, but contrast between shapes, contrast between colors, textures, patterns. But light and shadow is probably one of the most valuable elements that you can leverage in any photograph. But if you're not aware of where the light is coming from, you'll make shots in which shadows are actually obscuring important elements of your frame. They're ruining your shot. Like, for example, you've probably made a photograph where someone is wearing a wide brim hat, and it's the middle of the day. So the light's coming from overhead, you make a shot, and only later do you realize, oh, their eyes are in shadow, and I'm going to have to open it up in Photoshop, and then you introduce a bunch of noise. And a lot of that could have been remedied if you had first been observant of the fact that the light's overhead and the shadow's beneath the brim of the hat. And then you could have made a choice of, let me move you into an area of open shade so I have more even light, so I don't have those distracting shadows in areas where I don't want them to be. But for me, being aware of the direction of the light is a creative element, because I can pay attention to light and shadow and use them as a graphic element in my shot. As was this shot in San Francisco where I see that shadow cutting across the scene, and I observe as people walk through, the shadows are cast on the ground, and I see the yellow of the crosswalk sign, and then the thing for the handicapped, for people in wheelchairs on the bottom, and I see the relationship of color, and I see that little bit of red here in on the very left corner of the frame, and that stops me because I see, oh, this has some potential. This moment hasn't even played out yet, but the light and the shadow draw me to the scene, and I start making photographs until this woman in a perfectly red jacket comes in the scene and complements everything else in the frame. So this did not happen. I didn't just walk upon the scene and take the photograph. What led me there was the light and the shadow. And then I started making choices in terms of how do I compose the scene. And just because I was patient and waited long enough, something revealed itself. Now, there's sometimes when the light is diffused, when it's soft, but that's important to note as well, because if I know that the light is obscured by cloud cover, and I know that I'm not going to get any really strong light and shadow, I know that the colors are going to be more muted. And as a result of not getting that sharp delineation between light and shadow, that I'm going to have to be more reliant on line and shape in order to create images that have impact and punch. And you can see these shapes, the squares of the sidewalk, the U shape of the bike rack, the vertical line of the telephone pole, the rectangular shapes on the blue wall, right? So I come upon the scene, and at first I'm photographing people walking through the scene, and I'm about ready to leave because I've made this kind of shot countless times where I find an interesting backdrop and setting, and I'm just looking for somebody to walk past it. But part of me was really frustrated because I felt like, God, I made this shot before. But something was telling me this moment has potential for something. Stick around, stay here. And I did. And then a flock of pigeons flew. And I got the one frame with a bird on the right-hand edge of the frame. And I couldn't have asked for anything better. I couldn't have asked for anything better. But just as a result of being drawn to a scene, evaluating it, recognizing that line and shape were going were going to have to be an essential part of this composition, it helped me to set myself up for making a good shot. Same thing here. I'm walking down the street. I see this play of light and shadow on this wall. And I start observing it, and I start looking at, oh, look at that little red for this sort of utility box in the upper right-hand corner, and this yellow element on top of the phone booth, and a little bit of red on the left-hand side. And so in this particular scene, and in many of the scenes, I will tend to expose for the highlight, and you'll see that in a lot of images. So I'll do that in a variety of ways. Sometimes I will go to center-weighted metering, which will bias the exposure for the highlights and less for the shadows. If I'm in aperture priority mode, then I will usually reduce my exposure by maybe 2/3 of a stop, sometimes much of a stop, but usually about 2/3 of a stop. Or what I'll do is I'll simply set my exposure manually, and I will set my shutter speed and my aperture so that I know that I'm exposing for the highlights and I'm allowing the shadows to go black. So because I've seen the light and I've seen the shadow and I see what's happening with color and with shape, the stage is set. And that's a lot of what I do on the street. It's just I find stages, and then it's just allowing people to walk through. And I just got lucky enough that this woman on a phone serves as a counterpoint for one of the few payphones that are still in Los Angeles, creating what I think is a really sort of interesting photograph. Now, this image is the one that's on the cover of the book, and I shot this in South Africa. And like so many other times, I was simply wandering around. I had no intention in terms of going to any particular place. I was just like, I'll just go where the light is. And I walk on the scene, and I see this play of light on this mural. And I'm here for about 20 minutes, creating a variety of different frames, playing with the shadows, with the shape it creates on the wall, the shape that the signage creates on the wall. Again, I'm emphasizing the exposure for the highlight area, and different people are just walking through the scene. And I'm making photographs as different people, adults, families, men, women are coming through here. And then this little girl just comes out of nowhere. And I get her right at the right moment. And this is one of the magical things about photography, is that so much of her color, the color of her pants, the A on her shirt, complement the mural in the background. And I get her at this wonderful moment where her legs are splayed, her arms are thrust out, and her tongue is sticking out of her lip. But this was a nothing scene when I came upon it. It was just nothing more than just, a mural, a wall. But because I was paying attention to the light and the shadow, it drew me into the scene. And that's part of the fun, is going out there and going, basically like the title of my first book, Chasing the Light. I love chasing the light. And once you get acclimated to this idea of always observing light and shadow, you start seeing it even when you're not actively making photographs. I'm going out to have coffee with a friend of mine. We buy our coffee. We come out to sit down, and I see the light and shadow in the chairs that we're about to sit in. And so I just grab my camera and I just make the frames, because we're about to do something. We're just about to sit here and have coffee and chat. But that part of my brain that is constantly observing light and shadow has not disappeared. I'm still observing. I'm still responding, still making a shot. Whenever I'm walking around, this is in Paris, I see that shadow against the wall, and I see the door, and I see the window frame. And again, I see a stage. All my technical choices are taken care of, because even before this fellow comes into the scene, I've already determined what my ISO needs to be, what my shutter speed and aperture, what my white balance needs to be. All of those technical choices are taken care of, so I can just observe. And I can make those fine adjustments in terms of how much of the shadow do I include in the frame, how much of the window frame on the right And more importantly, exactly where do I need my subject to be in order to balance out the composition. So I make shots with different people walking through, knowing that they are not going to be the best shot, but they're giving me information. And they allow me to focus on probably the most important thing is timing. Because now I'm just paying attention to the pace at which people are walking through a scene. And so when the moment reveals itself, it's just great. And sometimes there's no people at all in a scene. I'm just walking across the street and I see this play of light and shadow on this building. And what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to figure this out. How do I make this an interesting composition? And I started paying attention to the subtlest things, like that shadow in the upper left-hand corner of the frame. That, for me, that little triangle of light is just as important as the main shadows that are playing against this wall. I mean, I tried verticals, I tried horizontals, I even waited for some people to come into the frame, but it was this simple play of light and shadow that made for a shot that I was really pleased with. And there are other times when I'll see light and shadow and there's nothing there. I just saw this curb and I saw the light and I said, I'm just going to stay here. And I was here for 45 minutes, just photographing different elements coming into the scene. And when this fellow stopped with his dogs and I saw this guy with a bike coming, I had already seen other people walk through that scene. So I knew that when he rode up onto the sidewalk, that shadow of his bike would be thrown in that area. So because I had been paying attention to that level of detail, to what would happen with shadows as people walked onto the curb, I was able to take a step back to make sure that I included not only the shadows, but the wheels and the dogs in order to make the shot. So you can see I'm always making a lot of choices even before the moment presents itself, because paying attention to light and shadow gives you so much information. So when I'm walking my dog and we stop by this coffee house, I'm seeing the light and shadow. That's what draws me in. And then I start observing and I see that little bit of orange through the window of this customer. And that lasts only about 10 seconds before she moves further in the scene and disappears. But because I'm not paying attention to what's happening with my camera, and I'm not fixated with what's happening with my camera, I don't lose the moment. So even when I take a portrait, I'm always thinking about, okay, where am I going to put my subject? And if I see a shaft of light and shadow, I'm always, oftentimes, drawing my subject into that, just to create a more dramatic portrait if I can. Sometimes I'll use more soft, more diffuse light, but more often than not, I'm always looking for a setting where I get to play off the strengths of light. You know, I'm at a street corner. We're all at street corners. We're about to cross the street, but I see this woman with this red dress and this yellow purse, and I see this crosswalk and this diagonal crosswalk, and I see how that line and shape and shadow informs each other, and especially in terms of the light. I don't have to do anything except move into position and try to frame the shot as carefully as I can. If I need to do anything at all, it's usually just adjusting my aperture in order to increase or decrease my depth of field. As I do with this shot here, I made a purposeful choice to go with a shallow depth of field because I wanted to emphasize this woman's hands and her nails. That's what drew my attention. But that's the only thing that I needed to do. And one of the important things to practice is I talk about going back to my default setting of 5.6 and my ISO of 400 or 800. Well, the reason I do that is because I always have a base to start from. So if I make a shot and I've adjusted my ISO or my aperture or even my white balance, as soon as I've taken those shots, I go back to my default settings. So if for whatever reason I have to make a change really quickly, I know where I'm starting from. Because I've all had the experience of you go out to shoot and your initial shots are ruined because the settings that you used for a shoot the day before or weeks before were completely inappropriate for the ones you were shooting in currently. And then the shot is ruined. Well, by always starting off from your default settings, you always know, okay, my aperture is 5.6. All I need to do is change my aperture or change my white balance, just because you're paying attention to light and shadow. So moments like this that are completely unpredictable, they're just I was just saw the scene, and I saw this girl on the left-hand side of the frame, and people were moving through the scene. I didn't know this was going to happen, but I just said, this has potential, largely because of light and shadow. And so as this woman ran through the scene, and this other woman raised her hand to her head, I had a shot. And sometimes there's nothing happening, right? Sometimes I'm just walking and I turn to my left and I see this alleyway and I see this light and shadow play against this wall, and how monochrome it is, this white brick wall, the white pole, and then that sort of T-shaped shadow on the wall. There's nothing here. This is just an alleyway. Most people would look at me very strange. They go, "Why? What are you making a picture of?" But because I was drawn into light and shadow, then I start seeing line and shape. I see color. And sometimes I see gesture. And for me, the gesture is it's this pole that's leaning over to the right plane, creating that shadow on the right. So I'm always looking for light and shadow. That's my priority. It's like, what's happening with light and shadow? And that leads me to other discoveries. So when I see the light and shadow in this scene, I see the shoes. I see this, this food kiosk on the left-hand side. And then I just know, I just got to wait. I just got to wait as people walk through. And so this sort of leads me to opportunities for things that I might not ever discover. Light and shadow, light and shadow. That's all I'm doing. Just walking through the scenes. If I'm doing a portrait, I don't immediately just grab a person and just start making their photographs. My first consideration is where I'm going to put them. Where's the light coming from? What's the quality of the light? How do I want to render them? Everything that I do and try to do is always informed by that awareness of light and shadow. And by practicing this all the time, I've gotten to the point that even if I'm in my car or in an office or even sitting in my kitchen, I'll just observe what's happening with the light, because I train myself to constantly be observing. Go to a friend's roof where he has, this arrangement on his roof, on his deck, and I grab my camera and I make a couple of shots, and then we sit down for a bottle of wine. Even though I'm hanging out with friends, this ability, this skill, this talent, whatever you want to call it, is still always at play. So even when I'm walking down the street and I see a discarded shopping cart, I see the light, I see the shadow, and then things get revealed to me, the shape and the line, the texture. And I see how something as mundane as a shopping cart can become an amazing photograph. Or a drain pipe and a shadow on a wall. Or a chair at a table. All of these things are as a result of me just paying attention to light and shadow and understanding how to get my camera out of the way. So by paying attention to light and shadow and basically conditioning yourself to be sensitive to it, you open up so many possibilities for yourself as a photographer, regardless of genre. Because though a lot of these images are street photographs, I apply them to portraiture, I apply them to still life, I apply them to nature and landscape. It's the very same thing. There are principles that are applicable regardless of what kind of photography you practice. And if you can start developing that skill in yourself, you'll find that you are less prone to feeling that frustration that you can't get good photographs. What you'll be able to do is that you'll be able to make much more interesting photographs much more consistently as a result of just beginning your journey of seeing just by paying attention to light and shadow. And then that will inform how you see line and shape, and then color, and then eventually gesture. And then you will basically put together all of these things in your compositions. And that's how you become a better photographer. That's how you become a more consistent photographer. And that's how you become a photographer who can look at their own images and make those value judgments in terms of, this is a good photograph, this isn't a good photograph, and then you understand why. So each time you go out there, you're building on your strengths, and you can't help but grow and get better and better. So that's it for my presentation. I'm more than glad to field some questions if there are any.
Hey there. I do have some questions for you, and I'm sure that people are going to, add more in now that we're doing this little question and answer segment. So go ahead and submit your questions that you have. If you've already submitted a question, I've probably flagged it. So let's see if I get to it here. I'll just dive into these questions here. So when you talk about making a good shot, are there different considerations for an art photo versus a photojournalism shot? And what are those different considerations?
Well, I don't do photojournalism. I sometimes do documentary style photographs because I do some work with nonprofits. But the same principles are still at play. When it comes to more photojournalism type photography or documentary style photography, I'm still making those aesthetic considerations. But for those kinds of images, I'm weighing their storytelling. So I did some work earlier this year for a nonprofit that has young girls who are at risk working with horses, farm animals, and learning organic gardening. So the same principles that I just shared with you in terms of paying attention to the direction of the light, the quality of the light, line and shape, informed each composition, but it really ultimately had to serve the storytelling that I was trying to capture in the photographs in terms of illustrating what these people do for these girls, the relationships they build with each other, with the counselors, with the animals that they tend to and are responsible for. So it's on the street. For my personal work, it's largely more aesthetic than it is storytelling, but sometimes it can bleed into each other.
Okay. Let's see what I have next here. Are you using Aperture Priority most of the time?
The great majority, I would probably say 60%, is in Aperture Priority mode, and the rest is in manual mode. And the reason I will use manual mode is if I purposely want to bias the exposure for the highlights. So what I'll do is if I see a high contrast scene and I don't care about the blacks, I'll bias the exposure for the highlights by metering, using center weighted metering. Set that exposure for that and allow the blacks just to go deep. Because for me, I'm using the shadows to obscure certain elements in the frame that aren't important to me, and so using it in manual exposure and biasing the exposure in that way allows me to do that.
Here's another one. If you don't see great light, do you skip taking that shot, or do you take it and try to make something out of it in post-processing with Photoshop or whatever application you use?
If there isn't great light, then what I have to emphasize are the other elements that I talked about, which are line and shape, like that one with the pigeon flying in the right edge of the frame. There, I didn't have the benefit of great light. It was flat, it was even. So I knew that it was going to be line and shape and the gesture of the bird flying through the scene that provide that shot a great element. When you don't have great light, you have to lean on other things in order to make the shot effective. The more of those qualities that you have, light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, if you have all those elements, that shot has the potential of really knocking it out of the park. But not every scene gives you all of those. So as long as you understand that you don't have the quality light that you might hope for, you have to leverage the other elements in order to make the shot effective. So I will take it, and all my shots are somewhat processed in Lightroom or Exposure X or whatever application that I'm using, but not to a great extent. I mean, if anything, I'm accentuating contrast to a great degree, especially with my black and white photographs.
Oh, this is an interesting question. How does someone evaluate if they've taken a good photograph? How can they evaluate that objectively? Is the question.
This is something that I touched on the book because I thought it was missing from a lot of the other instructional books. Is that I teach you how to look at a scene and look at it in terms of light and shadow, line, shape, color, and gesture. So you use those elements in order to create a good photograph. So later on, when you're taking a look at your images, you look at those same qualities within the scene. You start comparing your photographs that you shot during that day, and you try to see, just based on those aesthetic qualities, are there certain images that are stronger than others? And you'll quickly learn to be able to discern when the images have three or four, or maybe all of those qualities within the frame. You begin to recognize it. And part of it is that you're tapping into your natural ability that everyone has, because we live in a image rich society. You guys all know what a good photograph looks like. The challenge is being able to take that knowledge and apply it to your own photographs, because you have the more subjective experience of actually making them. But when you take that step back and you start looking at it graphically, that's when you begin to teach yourself how to observe and critique your own images. I have a YouTube channel, the Candid Frame YouTube channel, where I do a lot of critiques of images that people submit to the Flickr poll, and you'll see me doing a lot of what I'm talking about here on there. So if you subscribe to the channel or just look at some of the previous videos, you'll start getting an understanding of that I think you'll be able to apply to your own work.
We have a few questions about gear. What camera you use, what lenses you use. Do you use a prime lens? Do you want to talk about your gear for just a minute?
Yeah, I'm in between systems right now. I have a Samsung NX1 that I use primarily for video. I have a Fujifilm X100F right now, and that's pretty much the X100 series has been pretty much my everyday camera for the last 5 years. And I just upgraded my S to the F. For the past 4 or 5 months, I was using a Leica Q, which is a full frame camera with a 28 millimeter lens. But the bulk of the photographs that you see on my Instagram feed over the past 2 years have been either the Fuji or the Leica. And I just use fixed focal lengths just because with the zooms, I don't have to think about focal length. I just go, this is the focal length I have to work with, and I'll just zoom with my feet. It's one less consideration I have to make. If I have a zoom, then one of the things that can happen is that I'm adjusting my zoom, trying to figure that sweet spot, which can rob me of paying attention to the moment. So by using a fixed focal length, I completely eliminate that as an issue.
So we're down to just a couple more minutes. So I just want to give you a chance to tell everyone a little bit more about what they'll learn in your book, and what they can really take away from it, and how it will help them in their own photography practice.
Well, it's my hope that if you've ever felt or are feeling frustrated in that you've owned this camera, you've bought a variety of different cameras and lenses, you've learned all these techniques about Photoshop or whatever application that you're using, and feel like, damn it, I'm not making the kind of photographs that I want to make. I'm not making as good as photographs as other people make. I think this book is the solution to that, because it teaches you how to see, so that all those other things that you learned about your camera, about Photoshop, about compositing, whatever it is, it will give you a context that is often missing. Because I think what happens a lot in photo education is that people learn a technique or an approach, and they'll learn that technique and approach that emulates what another photographer achieves, and it ends there, because they don't know what to do it beyond simply duplicating what somebody else did. They don't know how to personalize what they've learned into their own unique voice. And so they're always questioning themselves as to whether they have any talent or whether they're any good at this. And my hope is that the book will begin the process for you to discover what you want to say with a camera, what you want to express, whether it's just documenting wonderful pictures creating wonderful pictures of your family, or whether you aspire to be a professional or a fine art photographer, whatever it is. I want this book to be the means by which you can discover your voice as a photographer, and reduce that frustration of, why can't I do such and such? This is the book. I have a lot of personal anecdotes throughout the book about my own journey, and I hope that as you read each beginning to each chapter, you'll relate to that and understand that it isn't because any photographer is special or just innately talented like Mozart. All of this is learnable, and it just requires practice and an idea of what to go for that will allow you to become the kind of photographer you aspire to be. And I hope that this book helps you to do just that.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for this webinar. It was really great. I just want to tell everyone else who's still here, tomorrow you'll be emailed a link to the replay if you choose to watch this again. And that email will also have for you the discount code that we've been sharing in the chat here too. In case you missed it now, you'll have access to that tomorrow too if you decide to buy Making Photographs. So thank you for joining us today. Barry Next, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me on your busy Wednesday. So very much appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Bye.